Thanks for joining us for CBN's On the Home Front, where we highlight what the men and women of America's military do to defend our country. I'm Mark Martin. The 328th Air Refueling Squadron is celebrating 75 years of history dating back to World War II. The squadron's first commander, 99-year-old Colonel John Moriarty, shares his story.
It's a special UTA as our 328th Air Refueling Squadron celebrates 75 years of its rich legacy. That dates back to the Lucky Third, the 3rd Troop Carrier Squadron, which started up its operations in 1944. It was led by Colonel John Moriarty, who commanded over 200 men on a very dangerous mission. How do we know this? Because we spoke to him. Meet 99-year-old Colonel John Moriarty.
At that time, you know, the war was going on and had been going on, and I had, prior to that, in the United States, had been, I think, at something like close to 20 different stations over a period of a couple of years. And so when the time came to go overseas, it was just another order, and which, as I say, was interesting. I can remember flying across North Africa and seeing the damaged and destroyed tanks down below from Rommel and where the British had fought in North Africa, and they were still lying out there on the desert. I was fortunate in that the men we ended up with a bunch of what I thought were awfully good non-coms. So the squadron itself, say, was I think unusual in the quality of the non-coms that we had, which I think accounted for this Lucky Third business. That we had some mighty good people there. The other squadrons, we were told that they talked about the Lucky Third, and when the time came to get a squadron symbol, this communication sergeant came up with that emblem that we've got. So he got a $25 savings bond with it, and that's been it ever since. Surprisingly, it's still alive. But we liberated a lot of people. We hauled a lot of people all over China, and it was just something that we did as best we could. While we were doing it, we lost 2, shot down by the Japanese. That's where I lost my operations officer. But only 2 were shot down by the Japanese, and I lost several more. They would either on hard landings, some of these. We didn't have any, say, airfields. We just these strips that knocked out of the paddy buns in Burma, and so we had some, and we had some, say, rather young pilots. They were doing some unusual stuff for pilots that didn't have any more training than most of them did, and yet, surprisingly, we did not have a great many accidents.
What do you think led to your success?
My success? I didn't know I had any success.
Yes, sir, you did.
Yeah, I guess I did I became a squadron commander, and I did get to be a lieutenant colonel eventually.
What skill set that you have, what's inside you that led to this journey?
I don't know, I majored in English in college. I guess I don't have any words of wisdom or inspiration or anything of that sort. That I am interested and surprised to hear that 75 years later that you people are that interested in your history, and that the organization is still in existence. I guess partly my organization, and that I'm almost proud to hear that.
Coming up, how CBN is stepping in to help a military family in need. Welcome back to On the Home Front. CBN honors the men and women in our military with an initiative called Helping the Home Front. It partners with churches across the country to meet the needs of their military families, from repairing homes to providing financial support to wiping out medical bills for wounded veterans. Sabrina Isaac was a single mother of two living in New York City. To make ends meet, she used credit cards. Sabrina might have remained in debt if she had not followed the advice of a friend. Because she did, she's not only paid off her debts, she's also working at her dream job and double her previous salary.
Queens native Sabrina Isaac calls the Big Apple home. She's a single mom to son Sky and daughter Soraya, who's away at college. She works at her dream job as a police officer in the New York State Courts.
I've always had a love for the law. As a court officer, I'm exposed to almost all aspects of the law, and I get to do what I love.
Years earlier, she was working in New York City's social services, struggling to provide for her children. She often used credit cards to get by.
Kids are expensive. Living in New York is expensive. It was financially challenging to maintain my household on my own. I know that I needed something, but I didn't know what exactly it was.
A Christian friend suggested she pray to God about her situation and invited her to Temple of Restoration Church in Brooklyn.
It was just a phenomenal ministry, and it was everything I needed at that time in my life.
Sabrina began studying the Bible daily and applied everything she learned to her life. But she had trouble understanding the lesson about giving away money, until her pastor explained Malachi 3:10.
It's the only scripture in the Bible where the Lord says to try me on this. But he says, challenge me. If the Lord is saying to challenge me on giving, then I'm going to try. I tried.
She also made another big change regarding finances. She cut up her credit cards and little by little paid off her debt. But her feeling of victory was short-lived. She received a letter that she was laid off and had 2 weeks left at her job. Sabrina took the letter to church and prayed for God to intervene. During the service, her pastor said something that caught her attention.
He said, there's somebody in here that's going to get a call in 3 days from their dream job. And right there, I knew that it was me.
3 days later, the New York court's office offered her a job that she had applied for months before. Sabrina was on her way to the police academy.
It was amazing. There's no words that could actually express my feeling, my emotions. It was awesome. It was amazing.
Her salary doubled, and her worries about money disappeared. Sabrina believes she's where she is today because of God's faithfulness. For those considering giving, she has some advice.
Trust God. Try Him. Try Him. Try Him. Well, God will take the little that you have and do exceedingly and abundantly above what you can imagine. He will blow your mind.
Up next, we take a look back in history at World War I and how it affected America's military today. Thanks for staying with On the Home Front. During World War I, the United States Army increased to a wartime presence and traveled Europe, supporting the Allies against the German Empire. We're bringing you the second episode of a U.S. Army original 7-part series called The Great War. Take a look.
When the United States declares war on 6 April 1917, the American Army is wholly unprepared. In terms of regular forces, there's roughly 133,000. That could maybe be elevated to 300,000 if you federalize the entire National Guard. On the first day of the Somme, the British suffer upwards of 50,000 casualties. That means the Army has the potential staying power of basically a week. when the United States declares war, the question arises, well, what does this mean? What are we calling upon the nation to do? How are we going to influence the war? The decision is made very quickly to send a small expeditionary force to France. The American War Department, under the leadership of Secretary of War Newton Baker, selects General John J. Pershing as the commander of what will become the American Expeditionary Forces. Pershing assembles a small staff in May of 1917, and they sail to Europe. Now, Pershing and his staff very quickly find out that the circumstances for the Allies is much more dire than they had thought. The French had engaged in a series of offensives in the spring of 1917 that were disastrous and had resulted in a number of units within the French army mutinying. Many of the French soldiers were arguing that they were no longer willing to attack needlessly in this war where they were just being slaughtered. They were still willing to defend France, but they would not engage in these costly, bloody attacks without any hope of victory. So Pershing very quickly sees that the Allies are in a difficult position in 1917. He makes the determination, along with his staff and in consultation with the War Department, that in fact the United States is going to need an army. The Allies very quickly send military missions to the United States upon the American entry into the war. And what they call for is men. They argue for the incorporation of American manpower into Allied units, which is something that we call amalgamation. Now, from an American perspective, there are a number of reasons why amalgamation is not acceptable. First and foremost is just national pride. It is going to be very difficult to convince the American public to send their sons abroad to fight in foreign armies. The other is, obviously, with the French, you have a language difference. The other danger is morale. How will the soldiers fight if they're not fighting for their own cause, if they're not fighting under their own flag? Wilson also rejects amalgamation because it does not fit into his objectives for the war. Wilson's goal is not to see the Allies victorious. It's more to overthrow Germany and remake the international order. To do so, that means that Wilson needs a seat at the negotiation table, at the peace table, and he needs a prominent position. And the only way that he is going to do that is if his forces make a significant contribution to the Allied victory or to the overthrow of Germany. The way that we're going to do that is through selective service. It's argued as a way to most effectively build an army using the best assessment of American skills. They're going to provide literacy training, they're going to provide physical fitness, they're going to provide moral instruction. It's one of the reasons why the idea of wholesome activities and the eradication of venereal disease is going to be so prevalent within the American Army. And this is because there's an implicit social compact between the federal government and the American public through conscription that says that if you give us your men, that we will return them as improved citizens.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be back right after the break. Welcome back to On the Home Front. Here's the second half of Episode 2 of a U.S. Army original series, The Great War.
The 1st Expeditionary Division begins arriving in France in June of 1917. By the end of 1917, the United States has roughly 4 divisions in France that equal to an estimated 200 to 250,000 troops. This is far lower than the Allies want, but it reflects what the United States had been really capable of in 1917. One of the challenges that the United States faces during the war is how do you train an army and how do you train one rapidly? Particularly, how do you train one in modern warfare when your forces are not experienced in that. One of the things we do initially is rely upon the French and the British, who are both going to send hundreds and hundreds of individuals and soldiers across the ocean to help train the Army. The training system that the United States develops is going to be a multi-staged effort. There are going to be several months training within the United States, followed by several months training within France. What you would think of as the training within the United States is going to be basic training, marching, marksmanship, close order drill, so on and so forth. The training in France is going to be more directed at trench warfare. The Americans very quickly become concerned about relying upon the French and the British to train their forces. Pershing does not think that the French and the British show the proper level of élan or spirit. He thinks that they rely too much on trench warfare, on static positional warfare. He wants more maneuver warfare. This is a very big debate amongst historians about whether or not he was right. By the time many American units go into combat, they're going to have insufficient training due to the truncated timetable upon which they were operating.
The Army had never done something like this before. The Army didn't really have the experience. And clearly by 1915, the tremendous attrition brought about by trench warfare, machine guns, no man's land, this sort of muddy, demoralizing environment where gains were measured in 500 yards, 1,000 yards, a few miles. A huge shock to the psyche, both of the military and the public. That was a challenge for the U.S. because we had no experience in that. We hadn't really had any observers in Europe, a few accounts. The British and French had sent advisors to the United States to try to help some of these camps get started. The question is, at these training camps, they're having trouble with just the bare basics of handling this massive amount of folks that have come in the military. Left face, right face, how to wear a uniform. The idea that they would learn a creeping barrage, for example, that is where artillery moves forward ahead of the infantry at a set pace, a very complex, effective but complex artillery procedure. That was really something that wasn't in the cards for training here in the States until late in the war. The idea was that when you get to France, the U.S. would be able to plug in, train in sort of training camps established behind the lines, then go through a process where they would serve alongside French units, and in small cases British units. They'd be able to learn sort of how it works, and then eventually be moved into a quiet sector of the front line to really stand on their own. So sort of a crawl, walk, run process. But this was a mental challenge because American doctrine, for example, hadn't really accounted for, by 1917, 1918, artillery and machine guns are the king of battle. Americans, including folks like Pershing, still thought that, this ethos of a rifleman. Right? A rifleman is the man who dominates the battle. By accurate fire, by maneuver, he will be able to advance and take the fight to the enemy. If his spirit is good, if he trusts his unit, he'll be able to overcome these difficulties. That didn't prove to be the case, and there was a learning curve during 1918 as American units do take high casualties. And we do see this in reports by Germans and by Allied, that is British and French observers, that the Americans are great soldiers. They're fresh, they're vigorous, they want to fight, but they're fighting in the style of 1914. So there is a growth period there. There is a definite period where people have to learn through practice. They have to learn on the front lines what works and what doesn't. A little less rifle fire and bayonet, a little more lobbing hand grenades to the next trench line, a little less frontal charges, a little more sneaking around under the cover of night to ascertain machine gun positions, which then can be hit by artillery. A little bit more professional style of fighting and less romantic 1914 style of fighting.
By the end of 1917, Germany finds itself in a position of strategic strength. The Italians have been utterly smashed in the Battle of Caporetto. The French had been bloodied and their army had mutinied after the Nivelle offensives. The British had suffered tremendously during the Third Battle of Ypres at Passchendaele. Russia had undergone the Bolshevik Revolution, and the United States, which was the one bright spot for the Allies, had only been able to land roughly 200,000 soldiers in France. So the question now is, can the Allies hold out long enough for the Americans to arrive en masse?
That's all for today, but you can find more of our exclusive news coverage at cbnnews.com. Hope you'll join us next time. Have a great day.